James, if I might now please turn to you for some thoughts and reflections on where we find ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex, and also for Bruce's very interesting presentation. I think largely I agree with most of it. I guess I would maybe say a few words in response, because I think although it's very clear that the US political system is potentially volatile and can change quickly. That could also have a longer term or a shorter term impact on American foreign policy and defense policy. I think it's also the case that there are some longer term trends that are in place that will continue to shape US foreign and defense policy, irrespective of the character or the nature of the political regime in Washington or indeed beyond. Now, of course, if a democratic president or leadership were to emerge in the future, it would probably have a slightly different foreign policy to that of Donald Trump, which is probably a little of an outlier in relation to US foreign policy more broadly. But I think nonetheless, there are some very powerful trends that are animating America's role in the world and the way in which it interacts with its transatlantic allies. Now, we've done a lot of work on this issue at the Council on Geostrategy. We launched a paper on this issue last year, and we've been doing a UK-US strategic forum where we're trying to prize open some of these issues and think about how they affect the UK and its European allies going forward, particularly in an era of quite acute and profound geopolitical change. And I think I structure my response or my thoughts along sort of 4 to 5 dimensions, and that is to say that irrespective of who is in Washington, I think there is a deeper, more longer-term structural pivot that's underway that will reshape the nature of the transatlantic relationship. I think in some quarters, particularly in Europe, perhaps at the beginning of the second Trump presidency, there was a hope that if we just sort of bide our time, eventually Trump will go away and it will be back to business. But I'm not sure that's the case. And if you look at the way in which US administrations, going all the way back to Bush II or to the Barack Obama administration, they've all been saying that Europe or Europeans need to do more to uphold their own defense. And that what Europeans, Britain included, have been doing to that date was not really sufficient. So there's something like a structural pivot that is underway. And I think this was the nub of it was grasped very well back in June 2011. So well over almost 15 years ago, when Robert Gates, the then US Defense Secretary, gave a speech to the Atlantic Council on the nature of the Atlantic or the transatlantic relationship. And he said quite simply, and I'll just quote here, indeed, if current trends in the decline of European defense capabilities are not halted and reversed, future US political leaders, those for whom the Cold War was not the formative experience that it was for me, may not consider the return on America's investment in NATO to be worth the cost. And I think we now see this with the Trump administration, and it's been really brought to the fore. But the geopolitical circumstances in Europe are such that some Europeans, particularly those to the north and the east of NATO, are now investing significantly more in their armed forces. But nonetheless, there are bigger strategic changes underway in relation to the rise of China and the way in which the American strategic community, and I think this is a bipartisan consensus, sees China both as an economic and as a geopolitical threat, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. And I think this has animated some of the Trump administration's thinking that was manifest last year, towards the end of last year, in the national security strategy, and then at the beginning of this year in the national defense strategy, which looks to rebuild the United States' position in the Western Hemisphere, that's to say the Americas, and to use that then as a springboard to project out into the Indo-Pacific and beyond in relation to the People's Republic of China. So I think here there's quite a profound geopolitical shift underway, and I think this is further amplified by the fact that Europe is not as important as it was in the Cold War or in the early 20th century, let alone the 19th, as a center of geopolitical gravity in its own right. And you can see this quite prominently in the US national defense strategy and the national security strategy, where both say that Russia is not such a threat to the United States, and China is the greater of the threat of the two in terms of threat. So this leads to a kind of reorientation of America's strategic posture that's been underway now for some years, if not even decades. But I think that this will accelerate irrespective of whether or not a democratic government returns to the United States, or indeed whatever nature that the Republicans might take in the future as well. Now, I think there are also another couple of identities or issues that are underway here, and that is also that there is a growing imbalance between the transatlantic partners, i.e., the Europeans on the one side and the United States on the other, in terms of relative power. So, if you look back to 2005, the Americans and the Europeans, or at least the Western Europeans, were broadly similar to one another in terms of GDP per capita or overall economic output. In fact, in 2005, 6, and 7, the UK overtook the United States in terms of GDP per capita, at least for a short period of time. However, if we look at the last sort of 20 years or so, you can see quite a profound change as the US has surged ahead, capitalizing on its energy independence, but also its dominance over next generation technologies such as AI, quantum, and so on and so forth, whereas Europe has become more stagnant. And also the issue of demographics, I think, plays a critical role here. So as the US becomes relatively more powerful than Europe, it has a degree of autonomy that it can manifest that previously it perhaps couldn't, or at least it was constrained by European economic influence, manifested, of course, at the time through the European Union. So I think this is also giving the US a spring in its step, which in some ways the Trump administration has taken to, if not its logical conclusion, and certainly has manifested it in a certain way, where the US is prepared to be more strident internationally than it was perhaps in the recent past. And then finally, I think there are 2 or 3 other dimensions here that are coming into play because of this. And that is firstly that the US seems to be withdrawing from the institutional arrangements that were born of the post-war, post-Second World War, and then the post-Cold War era, the transatlantic institutions that bound the two sides of the Atlantic together. And it seems to be increasingly now transactional because of its growing power, because of the nature of the Trump administration, and the fact that Europe is just not as important or as capable as it might have been in the past. And that the area of interest for the US is now increasingly that of the Indo-Pacific and China. So this transactional nature, I think, is coming to the fore more. Now, of course, that might be diluted somewhat under a different US government, but I nonetheless think that that's something that we need to keep in mind, and it's probably here more for the long term than simply an anomaly. And then finally, I would say that there have been a number of different issues that have occurred within the old transatlantic world that have added to friction within the relationship that might not necessarily have occurred if different political decisions had been taken, including within Europe. But I think also this has animated it a little more as well. And here we can think of things like the decision that the UK government took in relation to the British Indian Ocean Territory of recent, the last year or so, which the Trump administration seems to have frowned on quite prominently, but also some of the disagreements in relation to Iran, because they simply affect Europeans somewhat differently than they do the United States. And the United States, because of its energy autonomy, has a greater deal of bandwidth in order to deal with some of these issues or the fallout from them in a way that the Europeans do not. So I think if you add all of these different dimensions together, you can see that actually some of these changes or evolutions in the transatlantic relationship are here to stay in various shapes and forms. They will not go away. They may be changed or modified with different political leaders in Washington or indeed in some of the major European states. But nonetheless, some of them are here to stay, and we need to adapt and accommodate those and think about how to move ahead into the future under a very different set of circumstances than we experienced even in the aftermath of the Cold War, let alone in the aftermath of the Second World War.
Thank you. That was a tremendously interesting, very eloquent and detailed exposition across a very broad range of issues and plenty to unpack there, I think.